Welcome to our discussion of Chapter 16 in your AIS textbook titled Professionalism, Ethics, and Career Planning. Our objectives for Chapter 16 are to list and discuss characteristics of a so-called professional, explain how those characteristics apply to the accounting profession. We'll also define ethics in general and discuss some models or schools of ethical decision making, and then explain how to resolve ethical dilemmas. According to Dr. Nancy Bell, a professional is someone who exhibits certain characteristics. The first of those characteristics is the ability to communicate effectively. Effective communication for any professional is in part the ability to kind of translate technical or specialized information in a manner that it's understandable by everyone in the audience. And that's something that in your future careers you'll certainly be presented with. According to Bell, a professional is also able to think rationally, logically, and coherently. This is something you're all, already capable of, but that your future education certainly will help you hone before you get out of here. A professional is also able to appropriately use technical knowledge. This is very, very true in the accounting profession. If you think about all of our GAAP rules, our IFRS rules, tax laws, systems rules, our systems development rules, those kind of things. That would all be examples here of technical knowledge that any professional in the industry would need to be able to appropriately use. According to Bell, professionals also integrate knowledge from varied disciplines. In part, this is why business schools over the years have developed that more well-rounded model of education. So rather than just taking 30 accounting classes, you take marketing and management and operations. It's in part so that you can rely on that general business knowledge in your future career path and be able to integrate those different pieces in a manner that's useful for your current job. Professionals also exhibit ethical professional behavior, and we'll talk about ethics more in just a minute. They also recognize the influence of political, social, economic, legal, and regulatory forces. So they always have an ear to the track, so to speak, with regard to changes in the profession related to those external factors. So as new regulation comes about, for example, SOX, when it hit in 2002, drastically changed a lot of things that went on in the accounting and auditing professions. And those are the types of things that you as a professional will certainly need to be in tune with. And then professionals, lastly, are always actively seeking new knowledge. So some of you might be sitting there thinking, well, as soon as I get out of school, I'm never going to take another class. I'm never going to do any more training, anything along those lines. But I can certainly tell you that won't be the case. Not only will you be forced to, but you'll just want to. You want to improve your skill set. You want to improve your knowledge base in terms of making yourself better prepared for advancement opportunities or possibly new jobs altogether. So I'd certainly encourage you to keep that in mind as you head on into the next phase of your education. McDonald defined 4 criteria for a professional, the first being a specialized knowledge base. So some knowledge base that's not part of society's general knowledge. For accountants, that's very easy to kind of use as an example. If we think about our GAAP rules, our accounting treatments, our debits and credits, all of our financial statement prep. Those are things that the average person, doesn't know or doesn't need to know. So that is an example of a specialized knowledge base. Complex skills, same thing. Some of the math involved in accounting could even be considered complex skills if we talk about accounting for advanced financial instruments and things of that nature. Autonomy of practice, also known as kind of independence, doesn't mean that the profession is free of any rules or regulations, just means that for the most part it's kind of self-regulating. So the author of your textbook made a very good point about the accounting profession. It was certainly more autonomous before Enron and Tyco and all that mess in the early 2000s. Once SOX hit and all those regulations were changed, there was more of an external kind of regulatory control over the accounting profession. But it's still relatively self-governing, and that's really what autonomy of practice is concerned with. And then the last of those criteria, the adherence to a code of ethical behavior. So again, we're covering ethics more in just a minute, but really any company you would go to work for now, even if it's a smaller company, would very likely have its own code of conduct or code of ethics, and it would contain very specific prescriptions about how to handle potentially controversial situations from an ethical standpoint. It also would probably have some kind of process in place for reporting potential ethics violations. If you recall, SOX requires now that all public companies have those whistleblower lines. So this is what that's speaking to as well, right? So anyone in a public company now has to have the opportunity to call like an anonymous tip line and say, hey, I think something is happening that's not ethical, that's not right, but I don't want to attach my name to it in case, everything is okay. So ethics are really our moral philosophy, right? Our guiding compass. We could loosely define them as the rules or standards governing the conduct of a person or the members of a profession. There are entire courses on the subject of ethics and specifically on business ethics. And we can't really learn ethical behavior. As I said, it's certainly more of a gut feeling, more of a common sense type of thing. But we can discuss some issues related to the topic. So with an AIS, issues related to ethics would include certainly estimates. So if we think about financial estimates with regard to financial reporting, there are always ethical considerations involved there. We want to make sure we're reporting fairly and accurately, right? But we don't want to get into kind of earnings manipulation and those type of situations. Also, the use of data in terms of it being appropriately used. Also, maintaining strong internal control over all of our assets and specifically cash. And then paying for software and other forms of IT. So there's an ethical consideration around licensing, right? If we buy one license, should we really take the disk and install it on 30 different computers? That's a very small example of an ethical consideration with regard to that last item. There are three main areas of ethics if we want to think of it in a compartmentalized way. So the first being metaethics. Metaethics is looking for the source of our ethical principles. So where do we get our ethical principles from and what do they mean? So culturally, we can think about things like religion and those types of groupings as guiding our ethical principles. So depending on the way we were raised, if we were raised in a certain religion or as part of a certain ethnic or cultural group, we probably have slightly different ethical principles maybe than the person sitting next to us who was raised in a different manner. Second area, normative ethics. That's really looking at what moral standards are determining right and wrong and what standards should guide our decision making. So can we kind of figure out a baseline right and wrong and use that to make decisions that will always be considered ethical in nature? And then the last area, applied ethics, just as it sounds. So how are we taking these guiding principles and applying them to very specific controversial issues? So how are we making decisions that we're either going to consider ethical or unethical on the basis of all these guiding principles? There are some schools of ethical thought that your textbook introduced, and I just want to talk about those for a minute. So the first is the utilitarian school of thought. Utilitarian school of thought says that the end should justify the means, and that decisions should be made in a manner such that the greatest good is accomplished for the greatest number of people. So we may be able to kind of bend the rules if we're using that school of thought, as long as the bending of the rules benefits the most amount of people and provides the most overall good. The rights and duties school of thought says that in essence every person is acting for themselves. Each person has individual rights, and those rights shouldn't be interfered with by any actions of others. The justice school of thought says that people should be given what they deserve, and we should kind of consider their actions versus the results that they produce. Now, obviously, the big question there is, what do people deserve? And there's that's obviously up for debate. But the justice school of thought would just say, once we determine what people deserve in general, that's what they should be entitled to, and no decision should be made that infringes upon that entitlement. And then the last school of ethical thought here, virtues, just says that people should do all the time what is right, what is moral, what is virtuous. Now, again, there's certainly some room for interpretation about what is right and what is moral, but depending on what we've decided our morals are, those should guide every decision we make, and we should always keep those in mind if we're following the school of virtue ethical thought. Langendorfer and Rockness provided the model in your textbook for making ethical decisions, and some of it, again, I know seems fairly common sense or fairly straightforward, but it's worth kind of poking through. So the first step in their model said, let's identify the facts, right? No decision can be made without agreeing on the facts of that situation, what needs to be decided, what factors are available for making that decision, who it's going to affect, and so on. Second, we need to identify the ethics issues and the stakeholders involved. So here we're talking about identifying kind of those gray areas where, right and wrong might not be 100% clear. We're not 100% clear on who's going to be affected if we take, one route versus the other. The third part of that model says, let's define the norms, principles, and values related to the situation. So again, once we've decided what those kind of ethical gray areas are, what are the principles involved that we should be considering when we approach that decision? Fourth, identify alternative courses of action. So look at possible routes we could take in making this decision. 5, certainly evaluate the consequences of each. A lot of times here we're going to have to make estimates about what's going to happen if we do choose one course over another. The outcomes might not be known. So again, we need to weigh those carefully as we consider potential consequences of each decision. 6, pick the best, right? Look at all of our alternatives and decide, well, which is most likely to be the right choice, which is most likely to turn out best. Number 7, if appropriate, discuss with a trusted person to help gain greater perspective. So hopefully we're not doing this, whatever this imaginary decision is, on our own, right? Hopefully we're able to consult with others involved in the situation, get some differing viewpoints, and make sure we consider all the factors that we might miss if we're just thinking of it individually. And then number 8, reach a decision as to the appropriate course of action. So once we've considered all the possible alternatives, once we've kind of decided what we think is the best one, either individually or as a group, then come to that appropriate decision and kind of plug it in and see what happens. That's really it for chapter 16. I know this was a very brief chapter, so I certainly encourage you to read through chapter 16 in your text, and then also take a look at some of those end of chapter practice questions and discussion questions.